Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is a part 2 to my previous video, kind of analyzing the problems with the Prismatic Titan. And I mainly wanted to go over this because Prismatic Titan has gotten a lot of big changes going into this episode, and I kind of want to touch base on my thoughts for Prismatic and just kind of where it's at after all these buffs and reworks, and kind of talk about the still prevalent issues with the subclass, and more or less kind of where things have gotten better, and what changes I hope to see in the future that would really help balance out the worst aspects and parts of Prismatic without having something like Consecration Knockout just be the pure dominant playstyle on Prismatic. Much like the last one, this is pretty much just going to be a long commentary, so feel free to put in headphones and do some chores, do some work, whatever you need to do. But follow along as we kind of discuss the changes with Prismatic and the currently still existing problems. So starting off with the supers. For those that don't know, a number of supers in the game, basically any roaming super, was given a 30 to 50% approximate damage buff against champions, and also gets 3 times the super regen from dealing damage ticks against enemies. For something like Prismatic Titan, this means stuff like Blade Fury, Hammer of Soul, and Glacial Quake all basically got a massive damage bonus against champions, as well as also getting some increased regen. Pretty much meaning that you can get these all back very, very quickly with the right build. With something like Prismatic Titan even, you're naturally going to get these builds back in like 20 to 30 seconds without really any significant investment depending upon the weapon you use. Stuff like Outbreak is just a very easy to use option, and again, just using that means getting these supers in like 20-30 seconds just from dealing damage. As a result, the super that you can use on Prismatic has gotten a lot better. Previously, only something like Glacial Quake, Blade Fury, or Twilight Arsenal was really seen, and I would argue that really Glacial Quake and Twilight were really the only two that actually mattered. Blade Fury was good, but it just didn't have the same benefits it did on Strand that made it pretty decent. And then stuff like Hammer of Soul and Thunder Crash just wasn't really seen. This has also changed because Thunder Crash got a massive, massive damage boost in PvE. They were saying they were going to buff this by a little bit, basically bring Star Eater's effect down and slightly bring down the effect of Cuirass of the Falling Star a bit, but basically give it a base damage increase. And what they did is, I believe, almost double the damage that Thunder Crash does. So on Prismatic, when combined with Facet of Courage, it's basically like the DPS super. I'm perfectly okay with where Thunder Crash is out right now. In my opinion, Thunder Crash should be the highest burst DPS super in the game. It's one of the only ones where you're physically moving yourself to the target. And so there's a lot of kind of trade-offs with using it, like travel time, hitting the enemy, and then having to run back, because unless you're using like a strictly melee-focused setup, you're basically going to have to completely reset from where you were. So as a result, Thunder Crash does have those trade-offs, and it should be hitting as hard as it's hitting. So overall, the supers for Prismatic have all gotten almost universally better in some way. Twilight Arsenal was okay. It's basically the only like quick ranged option here, so it's naturally occupying its own niche and not really directly competing with something, kind of like how Blade Fury and Glacial Quake kind of are. But again, like, they all do something unique enough, and they're all fairly better now. So realistically, using any super on Prismatic is kind of a lot more viable before. If you remember my last video, I was saying stuff like, you'll never use Thunder Crash because Thunder Crash isn't really that great, and you don't really need to be amplified for any reason. Or that you're not going to use Hammer of Soul because, like, while Restoration is good, you lose out on survivability that's important, and yada yada. Now the supers are basically having their own trade-offs to that. Like the survivability issue with something like Hammer of Soul versus like Glacial Quake or Blade Fury is still there. Same with something like Thunder Crash. But now you're trading that survivability for having a very high damage burst DPS super, or for having a super you can get back in 20-30 seconds regardless of which loadout you're using. Because of these changes, the super options for Prismatic are way better. And realistically, I can now see any Prismatic build on Titan using any super, and I can see a reason for using that, which I couldn't really before, which is a big deal. Glacial Quake is still one of the best TDO supers in the entire game. It's pretty niche, but still very good, and again, damage resistance. Hammer of Soul, get it back quickly, has Restoration. It's a ranged option, which is nice for Prismatic Titan, because it really doesn't have that many good ranged options built into the subclass kit. Twilight Arsenal is a shutdown range option, and the Void Axes can also weaken, so there's a lot of utility in that. Blade Fury is really, really good. Mainly proc with Syntheseps to boost his damage, as with like any of these supers. But it's just a good kind of spammable melee with some damage resist. And then for Thunder Crash, again, one of the highest burst DPS anything in the game. Absolutely fantastic. This is where Thunder Crash should have been a very long time ago. And it gets even better when boosted by Cuirass of the Falling Star, which had its own series of buffs. So yeah, supers are a lot better now. I'm very happy with the supers are on Prismatic. For the abilities, starting off in your melee. Realistically, the only big change was really with Shiver Strike. If you remember, I said that this was basically the worst PvE ability in the game. This is no longer true. It's now just Shield Throw. Shiver Strike got a lot of reworks to it. Basically has its own slowing and freezing component to it now. It also has the funny launch mechanic back basically built into it. It's pretty good. I'm not going to go out here and say that it's fantastic because you're really not going to be like melting champions with this thing. It basically got the shoulder charge rework where if you don't hit a target, you still have about 85% of that ability left, which means that now this is a valid movement option for like PvE and PvP technically. So yeah, I think Shiver Strike changes are absolutely great. Definitely helps out a melee that was underperforming in PvE specifically in my opinion. And because of those changes, it's still... I'm still not going to personally take it over something like Frenzy Blade, let's be clear, but it's better. Overall, the same issue that I mentioned in the last video still applies. Frenzy Blade is just the objective best choice here. Shiver Strike being buffed, and then some different changes with exotic armors like Point Contact Cannon Brace does give Thunderclap a better reason to be used, but realistically, I still believe that Frenzy Blade is just the objective best choice here, especially when you consider the initial problems with the aspects, which are still very much present. Realistically, though, we have some better options now. Shiver Strike being better and having some exotic reworks come into the game definitely helps with that. But realistically, you're still going Frenzy Blade. And if not, I still think it's kind of a stretch to use anything else. Shield Throw is something I actually featured in a recent Void Titan build. And again, it comes down to the fact that Shield Throw is bad, but when it fits in well with the kit, it works well. It just doesn't fit in good with anything on Prismatic Titan. With that said, Frenzy Blade is still the best thing out of all these options. It's still what you should go with, and in my opinion, it's still the objective best melee currently on Prismatic Titan, regardless of how you play. Your grenades really don't matter, in my opinion. I do think that like some of the grenades that we were given kinda suck, in my opinion. Like Suppressor Grenade is like a pure utility grenade, and it's not bad, it's just like, I wouldn't really rock this for PvE. You know what I mean? Like, same with Pulse-Nade. Like, having a different kind of arc grenade would have been nice. Thermite's fine. Glacial Grenade is fine. Shackle's fine. The big thing with Glacier is, previously, we didn't really have a way to instantly break this. Consecration was stated to work with it, and it just didn't. So you could throw your Glacial Grenade for a debuff, but then you kind of had to, like, shoot it to reliably get rid of it, or time your Consecration to actually ignite an enemy near that crystal, since if you tried to Consecration into a Glacier Grenade, it would just eat your Consecration melee. Thankfully, that's been fixed, so getting the Shatter benefit from Glacier instantly without having to resort to shooting the Stasis Crystals is a lot easier now, so that is a nice bonus. But realistically, grenades are kind of unchanged. I still kind of feel the same way I feel about them, where they're fine. Not something you're really building into too heavily with Prismatic to begin with, but they're fine. For the aspects, and this is kind of the bulk of the video, I imagine. Let's quickly begin. Mandatory statement. Yes, Consecration Knockout with a damage resist super, or in this case Thunder Crash for a burst DPS option, is still arguably the best build in the entire game. There are some situations, like against the Witness, where this does absolutely nothing. There are situations where Thunder Crash with Frenzy Blade Knockout Consecration can't do anything. But where those situations work, which is most environments, it's arguably one of, if not the best build in the game. Stuff like New Vesper's Host Dungeon came out, and the final boss can be easily two-phased with Anarchy and this standard setup you're seeing here. It's ridiculously good. Survivability is very good on it. Of course, it's a little bit weaker using Thunder Crash compared to something like Glacial Quake, but it's still very strong. Knockout Consecration still hits insanely hard. I do think there are still fundamental issues with the playstyle that really hold it back, and that's why I mentioned earlier that in environments where there is high ad density and there are no long-range combatants to deal with, this build basically carries you through any level of that content. But anytime that you are dealing with ranged or elevated combatants and bosses that you cannot perform this melee on, or enemies like Tormentors, for example, that just do not really care about getting hit by ability damage, this build really suffers. With that said, where it works, it just trivializes all content. I mean, this thing is so unbelievably strong. So, keep that in mind as I say this. Prismatic Titan, I still think has a lot of fundamental issues, and I still really don't like build crafting with it. But when I want to get through content like GMs as fast as possible, I use this exact setup here. Let me be very clear on that. Prismatic Titan is strong with this one exact setup. And that's about it. So, onto the bigger issues with Prismatic then. Ignoring the Knockout, Consecration, Frenzy Blade combo. Let's talk about aspects. Unbreakable got a massive rework. Unbreakable is incredibly good right now. And I'm really happy to see it, because even remember from my last review of Prismatic and kind of yap session I had, Unbreakable was awful. Unbreakable was so unbelievably weak. It was honestly really lame for Final Shape to see that Unbreakable was as bad as it was, for being the new hype aspect. So what exactly happened with Unbreakable? I'm glad you asked. One, they dramatically increased the shield time that you actually have with Unbreakable. It lasts for a very long time now. And basically, as long as you're blocking and taking damage while you're blocking, it'll stay up pretty much as long as you need it to. And as you're blocking, it'll also grant you an overshield over time. And overshields also got buffed just to be stronger, by the way, which is a great thing. I still think they're fundamentally flawed, being that any kind of buff for your subclass, for example, taking advantage of stuff like Facet of Hope, for example, where you need that elemental buff to last as long as you can. Void Overshields are still kind of bad because they can go away instantly as long as you take enough damage, where stuff like Damage Resist or Amplified or Restoration will basically be there constantly regardless of how much damage you take. So Void Overshields kind of lack in that aspect, but they're a lot better than they were before, which is always a buff, and I'm always happy to see that. In addition, when combined with certain exotics, specifically on the Void subclass, you can generate a ton of orbs with this. And as a result, Unbreakable feels how it should have felt in the beginning. So with that said, Unbreakable is a lot better than it was before. It is way better. In fact, the very first build I made was on Void Titan, and I used Unbreakable, and it fit in perfectly. It's fantastic. Primary issue with Unbreakable, now we get to the bad stuff, with Prismatic Titan, is that it still has the fundamental issue of not really having any decent support from other aspects, and fundamentally very limited support from the actual fragments. What I mean is that Unbreakable still kind of falls into the same problem that it had before, and it's not necessarily the fault of Unbreakable being weak. I think it's perfectly fine where it's at. The problem is once again, whenever you use your grenade, and if you want to heavily invest your grenade, you can, you really aren't left with much else, and the issues with Prismatic Titan really become apparent, where you really only have healing through Knockout, which incentivizes you to use your melee, and that of course shoehorns you into using Knockout Consecration. Unbreakable is a lot stronger, and you can make builds work with stuff like Demolitionist support, or other grenade support, or other grenade enhancement options, like using stuff like Ursa Furiosa for super benefit, or using something like Armamentarium to benefit how often you can actually take advantage of Unbreakable, and all this other stuff. However, it's just hard to make work on Prismatic, and again, it kind of leads you into that same playstyle of why are you doing all this extra work when you can just melee them with one simple combination. With that said, Unbreakable is still really good. The fundamental issues with Unbreakable lie with the rest of the subclass and its inability to fit in well with an alternative non-melee kit, rather than Unbreakable being weak. You use Unbreakable on Void Titan, for example, you have a lot of support options to choose from that can make Unbreakable very strong. You can go with Void Overshield spam with something like Bastion and just have Void Overshields constantly, which have their own host of benefits. Control Demolition, when combined with it, is a fantastic way to just chain a ton of AoE ad clearing, as well as having some additional health regen, while you have the Overshield with something like Unbreakable. It pairs nicely with it. In my first build, I actually paired Offensive Bulwark with it, because Offensive Bulwark dramatically increases your grenade regen and gives you melee range when you have an Overshield. So then, hey, all of a sudden using Unbreakable gives you a lot better benefits, while also regenning itself from its own effect. Because this generates an Overshield, and while you have an Overshield, your grenade regen is dramatically increased. So it just fits in nicely. But then we look at Prismatic Titan, we don't really see the same benefits from there. And that's the fundamental issue. It's not that Unbreakable is weak. Unbreakable is very strong, and I think it's perfect where it's at. I don't think it needs touched at all. But it's just, from here, what do you do with it? Do you use Consecration with it? It's like, yeah, you can, but then you're kind of left without any kind of regen. And so you have to kind of rely on like orb pickup mods, or you have to rely on stuff like Facet of Mending to give you cure off of getting Unbreakable kills. It just doesn't really fit well. And again, like if you're going with Consecration, you're going Frenzy Blade, and then if you're going Consecration anyway, you're going to go Knockout. You know, that whole shtick. I'm not going to get into it. You saw the last video. You understand the point. Same thing. Knockout, Unbreakable. Again, you're kind of just focusing on your melee. Shoehorns into that. Drengr's Lash is still ass. I'll get into that later, but it's still, in my opinion, it's still one of the worst PvE aspects in the game. Diamond Lance got quality of life benefits in a recent buff, but it basically only really matters with Stasis Titan. So again, it comes down to like, okay, you can use Unbreakable to generate that Diamond Lance, and then you're kind of having to force yourself to use like a Stasis weapon with Demolitionist to work with both of these things. And it's just that Diamond Lance really doesn't work with a ton else. So like using this setup, you basically have like no intrinsic regen of any kind other than just using Unbreakable, which I wouldn't say is necessarily the best. Although, you know, it's fine. Pretty much any combination with Unbreakable you can use for like a general strike, and it'll work fine. But whenever you start getting into higher difficulty content, that's where it's like, okay, let's maybe focus on support aspects of this, like the Orb Gen. But you can't have that on Prismatic. That's only with Sentinel Shield. So as a result, you don't really have the support options, which means that this becomes a lot less valuable. It's still good, and I do think there's a case to be made with certain combinations and certain exotic armor pieces that, you know, that it could work. I just don't find them really that appealing or really that potent, especially in higher difficulty content. So Unbreakable is fine. The issue is that the subclass itself has like no synergy with other aspects to really take advantage of Unbreakable's effects in the way that Void Titan can. The other one is Diamond Lance. Diamond Lance got basically quality of life buffs. For example, it can now shatter stasis crystals on hit. This is good for something like Glacial Grenade and Diamond Lance combo. It honestly feels like something that should have been there to begin with. And while it's nice, I'm not a big fan of it on Prismatic. This is mainly a benefit for stuff like Stasis Titan, where you're generating so many crystals intrinsically, and also you have benefits to not only shattering them, but also like staying near them and generating as many as you can. And Prismatic Titan really doesn't have that benefit. You could technically use something like Diamond Lance with Glacial Grenade, with your Shiver Strike melee and Glacial Quake, and then have the Diamond Lance up pretty often to shatter those frozen crystals with enemies. But again, it just doesn't really make sense to me for Prismatic for why you would do this. It's mainly a stasis buff. With that said, using Diamond Lance is intrinsically better. But again, it falls into the same traps it did before, where using Diamond Lance basically requires you to focus yourself down a very specific playstyle, and when you do that, you're giving up a lot of options for survivability and pure damage. I'm always happy to see buffs, though. Let me be clear. So I think Diamond Lance is a lot better. I genuinely think the one thing holding this back is not having this spawn off of any elemental debuff. That's genuinely the one thing I think holding this back a bit, because I'm fine with it acting like a sort of reward for getting certain kinds of kills, but it's just so restrictive by being either an ability kill, which kind of forces you to do something like Knockout anyway, because then your intrinsic melee counts as that ability, or by using stasis weapons. You know, it'd be nice to see like, oh, well, you can build fully into like an ignition build with something like Consecration Diamond Lance, and having something like Facet of Ruin, for example, and then you're shattering and igniting and all this stuff, but having it only benefit from really like stasis debuffed enemies or then themselves ability kills kind of holds this thing back a bit in my opinion. With that said though, the buffs it got were very nice. I'm never going to complain about them. Again, my main issues stem from the fact that this is mainly a big quality of life enhancement for Stasis Titan, and not really anything on Prismatic. Now, if anyone was hoping for me to just absolutely tear apart a poorly designed aspect, this is where that comes in. Drengr's Lash. I have never really liked this. The first week that Drengr came out, I was kind of like experimenting with it. I mean, hell, I even used Kepri's Horn with it, and like made a cool little like barricade killing build kind of thing with like a lot of regen. Drengr's isn't good. It's not. If you like it, that's fine. I'm not trying to say that like you're playing the game wrong or anything. I just don't understand why people use this personally. And the main reason for that is it offers like very little synergy not only on Strand, but especially on Prismatic. And realistically, I don't understand why people use this. Like, I don't understand what the value behind using it is. You can briefly stun a unstoppable champion by suspending it, for example, but suspending is so weak in the current sandbox that, again, investing your class ability usage into this just really doesn't do well for me. And also the fact that it's like, you know, you're playing mainly from like a mid to long range playstyle with something like Drengr's Lash. You know, the whole goal is to kind of like isolate close range enemies and kind of punish them for getting close to you. And something like Drengr is cool and all, but it's like you don't really have any real good long range options. You know, the closest thing would be like, you know, suspending them with Drengrs and then thunder crashing into them. But again, you're also like bringing yourself directly to them in that instance, which on higher difficulty content, if you don't have good survivability, can basically be like an instant wipe. Hammer Soul is another long range option, but again, you're committing your super and something like that. And your intrinsic abilities really don't have any good long range options. The other thing with Drengrs as well, ignoring like basically everything else I went over in the last video and trying not to repeat myself for like 20 minutes. The issue with Drengrs is it doesn't benefit anything else. It's a very isolated aspect. And what I mean by that is using your class ability just simply suspends and that's it. If Drengr's got a buff, let's say for every enemy you suspended, it gave you 5% ability energy back for your grenade, melee, and your class. Just a small buff like that, all of a sudden, investing into your barricade heavily intrinsically gives you back Unbreakable. Something like this combination then can become pretty good because, hey, getting that Void Overshield means you get your buff back very quickly with something like Facet of Hope, which then intrinsically buffs Drengrs, which means the more you suspend things with Drengrs, the faster you get Unbreakable back. That one change alone would make this combination go from what the fuck are you doing to being, hey, that's actually like a legitimate build. Like, you can actually fully invest in that. And then actually using Stoicism with something like a class ability support would actually make sense. But it's the fact that Drengrs really doesn't do anything but suspend and doesn't have any intrinsic benefits behind it really hurts it. Again, you could pair something like Ambient Leap or Abiant Leap, whatever it's called. I can't pronounce it. English is hard. You can use this thing with it and get Woven Mail when you suspend a target and have better Drengr Slash. And yeah, that kind of does what I'm intrinsically saying here. Realistically, again, that's an exotic commitment for it. And again, it kind of falls into the same issues that I mentioned earlier, where I think Drengr should just do what Abiant Leap does at base. Again, Drengr needs a lot of help, but it's close to being good. It just needs a little bit of tweaking here and there, and then all of a sudden, a lot more builds become viable. It's just right now, for the huge commitment Drengr is, it's not worth it. And again, like I mentioned in the last video, if you want to invest in suspending, Strand is just objectively better in every way. So as a result, the aspects for Prismatic still fall into the same issues where Knockout Consecration is realistically your best option. You can have niche builds using something like Unbreakable, which are a lot better because of the Void Overshield buffs and just Unbreakable being a lot better in general. But it falls into that same issue where investing into stuff like this, you don't really have any other aspect support going into it. And so you're naturally kind of focused in using a melee build. And if you're using a melee build, again, Knockout, Concentration, Frenzy Blade, we all know that. Yada, yada, yada. Same with like Diamond Lance and Drengr's Lash. You can use these and you can use like Drengr's Unbreakable or Drengr's and Diamond Lance, but they don't really do anything well to each other. A good example I use is with a Prismatic build that isn't Knockout Consecration, you're basically using two separate aspects that don't ever interact with each other. And that's the fundamental issue. A lot of the best combinations in this game for like subclass effects on specific builds and playstyles have aspects that directly benefit and synergize with one another. Soul Invictus and Roaring Flames, Banner of War and Into the Fray, Winter Shroud and Stylus Executioner. Just name a few. These are all things that directly benefit the other, and with something like Diamond Lance, Drengr's Lash, Unbreakable, Knockout, when not paired with Consecration, it kind of falls into the same issue where they don't directly benefit one another. The only thing that kind of comes close to it is the potential of Diamond Lance and Knockout, because frozen enemies get 50% more melee damage dealt to them, and Knockout can intrinsically generate Diamond Lances. But again, this falls into basically you're using a melee build. Why bother with Diamond Lance and its cooldown and its restrictive weapon features to freeze an enemy and deal less damage when you can just use Consecration and Knockout, get half of your Transcendence meter build up from that one melee, and instantly kill whatever that was you were meleeing. Again, it just feels like these things do separate effects and don't synergize well. So if Diamond Lance could come from any elemental debuff, then all of a sudden that opens up a lot of avenues for it, and that's a very minor buff. That's a very minor buff. That's all it needs is better access through better builds. Because forcing itself to be ability focused basically mandates Knockout or stasis weapons. And realistically, I just don't think Prismatic Titan has that kind of support available to it, regardless of weapons or exotic commitment. And then something like Drengr's just needs a little bit of a rework. Again, like I mentioned, having it intrinsically give you something like Woven Mail will be huge for it, and naturally will massively benefit stuff like Unbreakable. And like I mentioned, as like an example, even if it's just like whenever you suspend an enemy, you get a little bit of ability energy for every enemy you suspend. Something like that would dramatically fix the problems that Drengr actually has and make the subclass a lot better. So in short, and not to make another 50-minute rant video, because I'm sure that's the last thing Destiny really needs right now is another content creator shitting all over it, Prismatic is a lot better. And I'm very happy with the changes that were made coming into this episode. I think all of these changes were good. I think the roaming super changes especially were a breath of fresh air for the game that brought things like Hammer of Soul, which really haven't been good for a long time, into a pretty viable niche. And honestly, having a super regen build on Titan that isn't like focused strictly on like Ursa Furiosa or Thunder Crash in some way is really cool. Like, I haven't used Hammer of Soul pretty much anywhere in a long time, and now I actually am. The buffs to stuff like Shiver Strike are definitely appreciated. The buffs to Unbreakable were absolutely needed and are very much appreciated. Stuff like Diamond Lance got some good quality of life features for stuff like Stasis Titan primarily. And while it does have some niche uses on stuff like Prismatic Titan, not really kind of the change I think it needs. And realistically, Drengr's Lash just needs so much love. Why is it in this state? But yeah, Prismatic Titan is better. I still think using Knockout Consecration is really the only viable thing on it for higher difficulty content, objectively. But with that said, now you don't have to use Glacial Quake. You can use Thunder Crash. You know, if you wanted to, you could even use a roaming super and have some pretty quick regen built into it. So again, happy with the changes. I like to see more. But that's kind of where I think Prismatic sits right now. Again, the build you're seeing currently on screen with Knockout Consecration is objectively the best in the game where it works. But I would like to see a Prismatic Titan build that isn't just this and actually works in stuff beyond the difficulty of a Legendary Lost Sector. With that said, it's kind of where I think it sits currently. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate you guys putting up with another yap session and complaining session. I'm sure we don't get enough of complaining in Destiny 2. With all that said, that's kind of where I think Prismatic lies currently. It's very close to being good in many different builds and playstyles, but there's just those few minor things holding it back that I personally would like to see changed. Thank you guys for putting up with another yap session. I'm sure we don't get enough complaining in the Destiny 2 community, and I appreciate you guys putting up with mine. As always, I will catch you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching and supporting these videos. And as always, have a great day.